Okay, so, when we think about entrepreneurship, like what comes to mind, right?
Yeah.
It's Silicon Valley, right? Or
Mhm.
like some huge startup hub in like New York or London. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I think a lot of the examples we hear are very Western centric.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of what makes this deep dive so interesting. You said over some really fascinating material about how entrepreneurship thrives in a totally different environment. And we're going to Morocco
Yeah, Morocco.
for this one. So
It's a very different context.
yeah, and what was so cool about the stuff you sent is how it like flips the script on how we usually think about like, these successful, startup ecosystems.
Yeah, and I think for me, what's really interesting about it is this idea that entrepreneurship can really adapt to different environments. And it's not this like one size fits all thing, you know?
Absolutely.
So seeing it play out in the Moroccan context is a great example of that.
Yeah, so like it's almost like entrepreneurship can kind of sprout up anywhere, right? If the conditions are right. So for this deep dive, our mission is to understand this engine of Moroccan entrepreneurship, right?
Yeah.
And we want to look at how both the formal stuff, like, the business structures and the regulations and the informal practices, like what's happening on the ground, how those two things work together.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so fascinating about this is it's not just about, bank loans and, official kind of setups. It's really about all the other stuff that's happening almost like behind the scenes.
Yeah, yeah, and that's like a good chunk of what we're going to look at comes from this paper you sent over. It's called Navigating the Margins: The Role of Formal and Informal Practices in Shaping Morocco's Entrepreneurial Ecosystem. It's quite a mouthful.
It is.
But so interesting. And what makes this paper so cool is it's written from this autoethnographic perspective.
Yes, and that's so key for me because it's not just like an outsider researcher going and, observing and taking notes. The researcher was actually an entrepreneur in Morocco,
That's awesome.
experiencing those same challenges and opportunities.
So they're like embedded in it.
Yeah.
That's so
So
cool.
it's like a really rich firsthand perspective.
Oh, okay. So it's like we have this insider guide to Moroccan entrepreneurship.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So let's jump into it. So the paper kicks off by making this point that so much of what we think we know about entrepreneurial ecosystems, like how they work, how they succeed, comes from studying wealthy Western countries, right?
Yeah, like the US and Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
And what the paper emphasizes is that, there are a lot of assumptions built in there, right? Like a lot of these traditional models really put so much emphasis on this formal infrastructure, like strong government support systems, established financial institutions like banks, a clear legal system, all that stuff.
Yeah, so like the playbook, right?
You
We
know?
imagine like, okay, for a good startup environment, you need venture capitalists, tons of funding. You need like, the government kind of paving the way. You need universities pumping out all this new tech, all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
And that's been the dominant model for a long time.
Right. But what this paper is saying is like in the Moroccan context, it's actually quite different.
It's very different.
Like informal networks and just community practices are way more central.
Way more central. And it's not that, the formal stuff doesn't exist at all, but there's this almost like a parallel system in place, this other really powerful way of doing things.
Yeah, so it's like we have to like broaden our definition of what an ecosystem can look like.
Absolutely. And I think this connects to a really interesting concept, the idea of dual economies.
Oh, okay, I've heard of that.
Yeah, so, De Soto was this economist who talked about how formal and informal systems can exist side by side.
Yeah.
And in a place like Morocco, where, maybe that formal infrastructure has some gaps, the informal system steps in and it becomes really crucial for people to kind of create economic activity.
Yeah, so like it's almost like if the official channels aren't quite there, or maybe they're too slow or too difficult to navigate,
Mhm.
people find a way, right?
People always find a way.
They always find a way and they rely on their communities,
Yeah.
their connections. It's so cool. So instead of just seeking out, official grants or going to a big bank for a loan, it sounds like in Morocco, the real power is in these informal connections and the trust that comes with that.
Yeah, and there's this great quote in the paper that comes directly from the researchers' field notes. They said, "I rarely use banks for funding. Instead, I ask my uncle or friends to help me. It's faster and there's trust."
Oh, wow. Like that just sums it up perfectly.
Right.
Like trust is the currency.
It really is.
It's not just like a nice thing to have. It's what unlocks everything.
It makes things happen.
And the paper really breaks down how, entrepreneurs in Morocco, they really rely on their family, their friends, their community for everything, for funding, for finding partners, even for navigating all the like red tape and regulations.
Yeah, like it's a much more relationship-driven way of doing business.
Yeah, and that's so different from how we typically imagine it, right?
Yes, it challenges that kind of like, very transactional, arm's length way of thinking about business deals.
Right. And think about this. The paper even mentions that a lot of smaller businesses operate without any formal registration at all.
Yeah, they're totally reliant on those informal channels.
So it's like their reputation is everything.
Their reputation, their word, that's what matters.
And the trust within their community.
Absolutely. And that's very much tied to, Granovetter's idea of social embeddedness.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that. I love that concept.
So social embeddedness is this idea that economic activity isn't happening in a vacuum, right? It's all embedded within these social relationships.
So it's not just like signing a contract. It's like shaking someone's hand knowing their family.
Exactly. And, in that context, your word carries a lot of weight because you're not just letting down a business partner, you're letting down your community potentially.
Yeah, there's so much more at stake.
There is.
Wow. So we have this like really strong system built on trust, built on reputation. But I imagine there's some downsides to operating in this mostly informal way, right?
Yeah, and the paper does acknowledge that, like, it's not all rosy.
Okay, good. I was going to ask about that.
One of the big risks is limited access to formal credit.
Right, because they're not going through the banks.
Exactly.
And then probably less legal protection as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. If there's a dispute, it might be harder to resolve it through, like, official channels.
Gotcha. So it's a trade-off.
It's a trade-off, for sure.
So this is where the paper talks about this, like, hybrid ecosystem, right?
Yes.
And that's what's so fascinating. It's not like formal versus informal. It's how those two things work together.
They kind of like weave together.
Yeah, they weave together. And the paper argues that, registering your business and complying with all the regulations, that does give you a certain legitimacy, especially if you're working outside of your immediate community or you're trying to do business internationally or something.
Right. You need to be able to play in that formal arena.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, it's those informal practices that really give entrepreneurs the power to act and like seize opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially
Especially when resources are limited or things are moving slowly in the formal system.
Exactly.
And there's another quote. I love this one. It says, registering my business was a formality, but I knew that the real support comes from my family and the local community.
Right.
So it's almost like they're playing in both worlds.
Absolutely.
And they know where the real power lies.
They know how to navigate both.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Now, the paper also talks about the role of local cooperatives, and it calls them these like quasi-formal organizations.
Yes.
Tell me about those. How do they fit into this whole hybrid thing?
So cooperatives are interesting because they kind of bridge that gap. They have some level of formal structure so they can operate in a more recognized way, but they're also deeply embedded in those local communities.
Oh, I see.
So they can connect all these different parts of the ecosystem and help people share resources and even like negotiate better terms.
Okay, so they're kind of like the connectors.
They're the connectors.
I love that. So this is all like super intricate and complex. Now, the paper dives into something else that's really interesting, this idea of identity and how much it impacts Moroccan entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And it talks about this onion model.
Yeah.
Okay, break that down for me. What's that all about?
So this onion model, it's this framework for understanding all the layers of identity that influence Moroccan entrepreneurs. And it literally is like an onion, right? You have these different layers.
Okay.
Like on the outer layer, you have national identity, but as you peel back those layers, you get into regional identity, maybe tribal affiliations, family ties, linguistic identities.
Wow, so many layers.
Yeah.
And the paper is saying that all those layers play a role in how entrepreneurs make decisions.
Absolutely. It affects who they trust, how they get resources, how they navigate challenges. It's not just like a single culture. There's so much nuance within it.
Okay, so like, if a Moroccan entrepreneur needs a business partner, they might not just pick whoever has the best resume.
Right.
They might prioritize someone from their village or their family.
Right.
Because there's that built-in trust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That shared history.
Right. And there's another great quote that says, "In my village, everyone knows everyone. If I succeed, it's seen as a win for all of us. That's why they're willing to help me, even if it means taking risks."
I love that quote.
Right. So
It
powerful.
shows how strong that sense of collective identity is.
And how everyone's invested in each other's success.
Yeah.
Now, the paper also mentions this interesting thing about Morocco's linguistic diversity. You have Arabic, Kamazite, French all being spoken.
Yeah.
How does that impact the business world?
It definitely adds a layer of complexity.
Yeah, imagine.
Entrepreneurs might need to be multilingual to reach different customers or negotiate with different partners.
Right, so it's like another skill set you need to have.
It is, but it also creates opportunities for people who can bridge those gaps.
Yeah, those connectors again.
Exactly.
So taking all this into account, it seems like Morocco really challenges how we typically define a successful entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Absolutely. And the paper really emphasizes that it challenges those models that are so focused on formal institutions and top-down support.
Right. It's like they're saying we need to broaden our perspective.
Exactly. And think about ecosystems as these hybrid systems.
Yeah, where both formal and informal are essential.
Exactly.
And it's not just this paper either, right? Like there are other scholars who are calling for this kind of like more nuanced understanding of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, people like Shrivers et al. They're all arguing for more context-specific approaches.
Yeah, because what works in Silicon Valley might not work in Morocco.
Exactly.
So given this hybrid dynamic, what are some things that like policymakers should be thinking about?
I think the big takeaway is that policymakers need to understand the value of those informal networks.
Right, not just dismiss them.
Exactly. Instead of just focusing on traditional top-down programs, they should think about how to leverage those existing networks and maybe even help formalize some of those practices.
Yeah, that's so smart. Like how can we build bridges instead of just trying to impose a system that doesn't really fit?
Right. And the paper talks about the potential of linking formal organizations with these community-based networks.
Yeah, like creating partnership.
Partnerships, exactly.
Now, the paper does mention some limitations, which is always a good sign of a well-done study. What were some of the things they pointed out?
Well, the main limitation is that the autoethnographic approach, while it's really valuable for getting that deep dive, it might not apply perfectly to every other non-Western context.
Right, so it's like one very specific case study.
Exactly.
So what are some things that future research could look at to kind of build on this?
Well, the paper suggests doing more comparative research in other parts of the world.
Oh, that'd be so interesting.
Right, like how does this play out in other parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America?
Yeah. And how much of this is specific to Morocco versus like broader patterns?
Exactly.
So cool. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Morocco's entrepreneurial ecosystem is like this really unique and resilient thing.
It is.
And it's a testament to the power of social capital and community and just the ability to adapt, right?
And it shows how strong cultural identity can be a driver for economic activity.
Yeah, so it's not just about like, having the best technology or the most funding.
Yeah.
It's about these deep connections and trust and this willingness to support each other.
Absolutely.
So for you, our listener, we want to leave you with this thought. Think about the principles we've talked about today, this idea of trust-based networks and leveraging your community. How could you apply that in your own work, whether you're an entrepreneur or just working on a project?
Yeah.
What are those informal strengths that you might be overlooking?
Yeah. What's already there that you can tap into?
Food for thought.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive on Morocco.
It was fascinating.
Until next time.
See ya.